Ethan froze in the doorway, caught off guard by a scene he never expected. On his couch sat Sophie, the woman he had hired for just one night to play the part of his date at a gala. Yet here she was, cradling his 7-year-old daughter in her arms as if she had known her forever. Lily pressed against her shoulder, clutching the sleeve of her dress, already drifting into sleep. And then, in the hush of the room, came the whispered words that left Ethan breathless. "Daddy, can Sophie stay forever?" Ethan Cole adjusted the angle of his cuff links until the edges sat perfectly parallel with the seam of his shirt. The habit was old, automatic, and soothing in a way that never showed on his face. Control lived in these small corrections, the invisible architecture that kept everything upright when the world leaned sideways. In the mirror, the man staring back at him looked composed, sharp jaw, hair combed with exact patience, gray eyes that rarely betrayed what they knew. From a distance, he resembled certainty. Up close, he resembled effort. He breathed in, slow and measured. "You actually hired someone," he murmured to the empty room, and the words sounded stranger out loud than they had on the phone with the agency. An arrangement, he had called it. Professional. Contained. Nothing messy, nothing binding. He had rehearsed those words the same way he rehearsed earnings calls. He walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows. Manhattan glowed in bands of light, the river a dark ribbon threaded through it all. Somewhere below, guests were already arriving at the hotel ballroom, names and titles tracing a map of influence he'd spent years learning to read. Their questions had grown predictable. "When will you remarry, Ethan? Lily needs a mother figure, doesn't she? Are you spread too thin?" The questions never arrived as attacks. They came as kindly phrased evaluations, cloaked concerns about stability, about risk. Investors did not like risk, especially the kind that looked like loneliness. His gaze shifted to the framed school portrait on the console table. Lily's hair bow was slightly crooked in the photo, her smile earnest, the hint of one newly lost tooth breaking the line. 7 years old and already a master of quiet observation. She had learned that from him, watching first, speaking later. After her mother left, the house learned silence as a survival skill. He learned to make breakfast and check homework and answer late-night emails with a child asleep against his shoulder. He learned to remove every sharp edge he could reach from the life they shared. "Dad?" He imagined her voice, small, curious. It always arrived that way in his mind when he was about to make a choice he couldn't explain. He set the frame down gently. Tonight wasn't about pretending Lily needed someone else. It was about protecting the company he had built for her future. A merger that would secure thousands of jobs didn't fail because a CEO showed up alone one too many times, but reputations cracked along hairlines long before they split. He refused to offer anyone a chisel. He'd been clear with the agency. "Discretion is non-negotiable," he'd said. "No tabloid angles, no social media hints, no history I have to manage." The coordinator's voice had been brisk, practiced. "Understood, Mr. Cole. She'll arrive at 7. Elegant, appropriate, and perfectly at ease in a room like yours." He had almost canceled twice before confirming. Compromise never sat well in his stomach, but pragmatism was a different kind of honesty. He checked his watch. 6:41. The penthouse was quiet except for the low hum of the air system and the distant city. On the dining table, place cards and seating charts from earlier meetings lay stacked with a precision that looked like calm from across the room. He reached for the stack and squared the corners again anyway. Tonight's guest list included 2 board members who still measured leadership in wedding bands, a journalist who wrote like a surgeon, and the acquisition partner who smiled with all the detachment of a spreadsheet. The performance would be simple, appear anchored, appear complete, appear untroubled by anything except the business at hand. He poured water into a crystal glass and drank half of it, then set the glass down in the exact center of a coaster. If he focused on the coaster, he didn't have to think about the worst part, the possibility of his daughter meeting a stranger in their home. He had tried to limit that risk by arranging for the sitter, but Lily had insisted on seeing the fancy lights tonight, and for once, he didn't have the energy to deny her. He had written rules in his head instead. Minimal contact, clear boundaries, no promises implied or imagined. His phone buzzed on the console. A calendar alert. Gala call time, 7:30. Beneath it, an email still open from earlier. His reply to the agency confirming the fee, the schedule, the dress code. He read the final line again, almost as if the sentence could absolve him. This is purely professional. He heard his own father's voice then, uninvited, from a distance made of years. If you can't say it without defending it, you're not convinced. He shut the email. He moved back to the mirror and adjusted his tie, slower this time. He remembered Lily, 5 years old, tugging at that same knot before a school recital, asking if the tie made him too serious. He'd crouched to her height and said, "Serious isn't the same as unkind." It was the best he could offer her then, and most days it was still the best he could offer anyone. A steadiness that rarely announced itself, that preferred to work in the background, invisible as oxygen. The elevator dinged down the hall, a soft, distant chime that tightened his shoulders without his permission. He looked around the room one more time. The tidy surface of the kitchen island, the single coat waiting on the back of a chair, the gift bag Lily had prepared for whoever Daddy brings, stuffed with a crayon drawing and 2 butterscotch candies. He almost moved it out of sight, then didn't. He had taught Lily not to lie to herself about what she wanted. He refused to teach himself the opposite. He straightened, exhaled, and practiced neutrality on his face. "You'll be gracious," he told his reflection. "You'll be clear." The rules assembled themselves like a checklist. No personal questions offered, none answered. No stories long enough to turn into memories. Leave the evening exactly as you found it. The logic was flawless. Only the silence inside him felt flawed, a place where something unnameable pressed against the edges and asked why a man who managed risk for a living would invite it into his home. The doorbell rang at precisely 7. Ethan's hand hovered a fraction of a second above the handle, long enough for the quiet to say one last thing. Be careful what you normalize. He closed his fingers around the metal and opened the door. The clock on the mantel clicked past 7 as the chime of the doorbell cut into the quiet. Ethan's hand, steady in every boardroom he had ever commanded, hesitated a fraction above the handle. He drew a breath, forced his shoulders into the familiar line of confidence, and pulled the door open. Sophie Hart stood in the doorway. For a second longer than was polite, Ethan didn't speak. He had expected a rehearsed glamour, someone polished to the point of sterility, exactly the kind of person who could survive a room of investors without leaving an impression. Instead, there was this. A woman in a simple black dress, fabric falling in clean lines that framed her figure without demanding notice. Her auburn hair spilled in loose waves, her hazel eyes clear and disarmingly warm. She smiled, not the brittle smile of contract, but one that felt like a sudden shift in temperature. "Mr. Cole?" she asked, voice measured, low enough not to echo against the marble floor. "Ethan," he corrected quickly, stepping aside. "Please, come in." Her heels clicked softly as she crossed the threshold, the faintest trace of vanilla and something floral following her into the penthouse. She moved without the stiffness he expected, no overt performance, no air of pretense. She looked around briefly, but not with the acquisitive eye of someone evaluating wealth. It was closer to curiosity, restrained but real. Before he could offer a drink, the patter of small feet charged across the polished floor. "Daddy!" Lily's voice rang, bright, unguarded. She appeared in a flash of pink fabric, her bow tilting halfway out of her hair, eyes wide as she froze at the sight of Sophie. Usually she tucked herself into Ethan's leg in moments like this, her trust a fortress built slowly, cautiously. Ethan braced for the familiar cling, already ready to deflect her questions with a half-truth. Instead, Lily tilted her head. "Are you Daddy's friend?" The words carried curiosity rather than suspicion, her tone somewhere between wonder and challenge. Ethan's chest tightened. This was the moment he hadn't wanted. Confusion, attachment, the risk of creating expectations. He opened his mouth, prepared to intervene. But Sophie crouched gracefully, lowering herself until her eyes met Lily's at level. The black dress pulled softly against the floor, her posture patient. "Hi, Lily," Sophie said gently. "Yes, I'm your dad's friend for tonight. And I have a problem." She whispered the last word conspiratorially, leaning closer. "I don't know anyone at this party. Do you think you could be my partner in crime?" Lily giggled, the sound light and sudden, as if a gate had swung open. Without a trace of hesitation, she slipped her small hand into Sophie's. Ethan blinked, unprepared for the sight. His daughter, his careful, guarded daughter, rarely gave herself away so quickly. Relatives had come and gone. Well-meaning nannies had tried and failed, and still Lily's world had remained small, cautious. But now, in a single exchange, she was laughing like she had known Sophie longer than 3 breaths. Ethan adjusted his cuff link again, though it no longer needed adjusting. The gesture hid the unsteady stir in his chest. Something about this didn't follow his rules, didn't belong to the careful lines he had drawn around the night. And yet, as he watched Sophie squeeze Lily's hand lightly and rise with effortless grace, he knew the image of them together would not leave him quickly. "Ready?" Sophie asked, directing the question at Lily instead of him. "Ready," Lily chirped, her bow bouncing as she nodded. Ethan cleared his throat, reclaiming his role. "The car's waiting," he said, more firmly than necessary. He reached for his coat, steady again, but the thought pressed against him nonetheless. This wasn't supposed to happen. By the time the car eased to a stop in front of the ballroom, the city's night had already dressed itself in crystal and fire. The chandeliers inside glowed so brightly their reflections spilled onto the sidewalk, catching on the polished glass doors. Ethan stepped out first, composed, polished, every gesture measured. He turned back for Sophie, offering his hand, not because he doubted her balance, but because every camera flash nearby had a hunger for symbolism. She accepted with the faintest smile, her hand light in his. Lily clambered out behind them, clutching Sophie's fingers as though she had no intention of letting go. Ethan had thought she might grow shy under the bright lights, but his daughter stood tall in her pink dress, while still slightly askew, her curiosity burning brighter than her nerves. Inside, the grand ballroom was alive. Crystal chandeliers rained light across marble floors, and the air buzzed with conversation, the sound layered with clinking glasses and the swell of a string quartet. Waiters wove through the crowd with trays of champagne. Ethan's name rippled from one corner to another before he even finished his first introduction. "Cole," a board member greeted, eyes sharp, glass in hand. Then, inevitably, the man's gaze shifted to Sophie. "And who is this lovely companion?" "This is Sophie," Ethan said evenly, resting his hand just lightly against the small of her back. "She's been kind enough to join us tonight." Sophie extended her hand. Her smile was polite but not rehearsed, her voice carrying warmth without overreaching. "It's wonderful to meet you. Ethan has spoken so highly of his team." She asked a thoughtful question about a recent project, drawing the board member into genuine conversation before Ethan even had to step in. Ethan watched, surprised. Most people tried too hard in rooms like this, either demanding attention or disappearing into corners. Sophie did neither. She listened, laughed at the right moments, and steered conversations without a trace of artifice. Investors who normally measured worth in numbers leaned closer when she spoke. But what caught Ethan most wasn't the way she managed them. It was the way she managed Lily. His daughter, who usually shrank behind him at events, was suddenly animated at Sophie's side. When one investor bent to greet her, Lily faltered, words tumbling out awkwardly. Sophie crouched, whispered something only Lily could hear, and suddenly Lily grinned, finding the courage to finish her sentence. The investor chuckled, charmed. When Lily attempted a riddle halfway through dessert, fumbling the punchline, Sophie laughed as though it were the cleverest joke she had ever heard. Lily's face glowed, triumphant, and Ethan, sipping his drink at the edge of the circle, felt the ground shift under him. He should have been watching the room, calculating the mood, scanning for subtle shifts in alliances and interest. That was what he always did. But instead, his gaze kept sliding back to the small tableau of Sophie kneeling to meet Lily's eyes, or brushing a stray strand of hair behind her ear as she encouraged her to speak louder. And Lily, his guarded, careful Lily, was blooming under it. This wasn't supposed to happen, Ethan thought, fingers tightening slightly around his glass. She was supposed to be a shield, nothing more. A buffer against questions, an accessory for appearances. But standing there, watching them move together through the crowd as if they belonged, the narrative he had built for tonight unraveled. Hours passed, deals sealed, conversations archived for later. By every metric, the evening was a success. Investors left satisfied, the merger safe, the company's image polished to brilliance. Yet when Ethan looked across the room and caught Sophie laughing at another of Lily's riddles by the dessert table, he realized he hadn't thought about contracts or profits in the last 10 minutes. Instead, he thought about the way Sophie's presence softened the hard edges of the night. He thought about Lily's hand curled firmly in Sophie's, unwilling to let go. He thought, against his own rules, about how dangerous it felt to want this temporary arrangement to last longer than tonight. The penthouse was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the sound of a spoon clinking against a ceramic bowl. Morning light filtered through the tall windows in pale streaks, softening the sharp edges of the living room. Ethan sat at the head of the breakfast table, his laptop open in front of him, unread emails stacked like unopened doors. His hand rested near the keyboard, but his attention was caught between the rising steam of his coffee and the small voice across the table. "Daddy," Lily said, her spoon dipping into her cereal with deliberate slowness. "Can Sophie come over?" Ethan looked up. He had prepared himself for questions about school projects or a request for a new toy, but not this. "We'll see," he said, careful, neutral. Lily didn't look convinced. She tapped her spoon against the bowl, a rhythm of determination. "No, I mean, maybe forever." The word landed with a weight Ethan couldn't disguise. His throat tightened, the coffee suddenly sharp on his tongue. He was a man who could stare down a boardroom of ruthless investors without a tremor, but this question from his daughter made him nearly choke. Forever. It rang in his mind, as dangerous as it was tempting. "She's busy, Lily," he managed finally, forcing steadiness into his voice. "Sophie has her own life." Lily frowned, her little shoulders slumping. She stared into her cereal as if it held the answer she wanted. "But she makes the parties fun, and she listens to my jokes." Her eyes lifted, full of the stubborn honesty he both admired and feared. "You never laugh at them." Ethan raised an eyebrow, fighting the corner of his mouth from softening. "That's because your jokes don't make sense, Peanut." "They do to Sophie," Lily shot back, triumphant in her defense. The silence stretched, filled with something Ethan didn't want to examine. Sophie wasn't supposed to matter. She had been hired for one night, a barrier between him and the relentless curiosity of a corporate world that thrived on vulnerability. Nothing more. But now his daughter was asking for her, as if she were already part of their lives. That was the problem. That evening, after Lily was tucked beneath her blanket and the apartment had settled into its nightly hush, Ethan poured himself a glass of scotch. He sank onto the leather sofa, the city lights bleeding through the windows, neon and gold against the night sky. He told himself he should close this chapter cleanly. Let Sophie remain a professional arrangement, a check already written and filed. The story was supposed to end at the gala's conclusion, but his mind refused. Instead, it replayed the small things. The way Sophie's hazel eyes softened when Lily spoke, how she had crouched without hesitation to meet his daughter at eye level, how she never looked inconvenienced. He remembered his own laugh, the one he hadn't rehearsed or controlled, slipping out at Lily's side while Sophie encouraged her riddles. That laugh had felt unfamiliar, almost foreign, yet achingly necessary. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, pulling him from thought. An email notification lit up the screen. From Sophie. Subject, "Thank you." Message, "Ethan, thank you for last night. Your daughter is lovely. She's a very bright little girl. I hope she enjoyed herself. Best of luck with your merger. Sophie." Polite. Professional. Short. And yet Ethan read it 3 times, searching for something unspoken between the lines. He told himself not to reply. His rational side argued firmly. This was business, nothing more. Boundaries existed for a reason. Still, his fingers hovered over the keyboard. The father in him, the man who had been alone for too long, moved faster than logic. Reply. "She hasn't stopped talking about you. If you're free, would you like to join us for coffee? No boardrooms this time. Just Lily, me, and you." He read the words once, felt their weight, and before doubt could claw its way back, he pressed send. The glass of scotch sat forgotten on the table. For the first time in years, Ethan felt like he had stepped into a place with no script, no strategy. Just risk, and the chance that forever might not be as dangerous as it sounded when spoken by a child. The corner cafe smelled of roasted beans and fresh pastries, a far cry from the polished sterility of Ethan's usual haunts. He had chosen it deliberately, neutral ground, quiet enough for conversation, ordinary enough to lower the stakes. Still, his pulse ticked a little faster than he liked as he sat at the table by the window, watching the door. He reminded himself this was just coffee. Just closure, perhaps. A small thank you for a night that had gone better than expected. Nothing more. Then the bell above the door chimed, and Sophie stepped inside. For a second, Ethan forgot to stand. She looked different without the black dress and heels, yet no less striking. A simple sweater, jeans, hair falling loose around her shoulders. She looked like someone who belonged in the warmth of a cafe, not merely in the spotlight of a gala. "Daddy," Lily squealed before Ethan could rise. She darted from her chair, arms flung wide. Sophie barely had time to crouch before the little girl wrapped herself around her waist. Sophie laughed, her voice carrying like light through glass. She hugged Lily back with unhesitating warmth. Ethan stood now, slower, his throat tightening at the sight. He gestured toward the table. "Coffee." They settled into their seats. Ethan across from Sophie, Lily wedged happily between them, still holding Sophie's hand as though afraid letting go might make her vanish. The waitress took their order, and for a moment Ethan simply listened. Sophie told Lily stories about her college theater days, about missed cues and stage fright, her voice animated, her self-deprecating humor effortless. Lily's eyes were wide, every word absorbed as though Sophie were weaving spells instead of recounting memories. Ethan found himself laughing, genuinely laughing, at Sophie's tale of forgetting lines and improvising nonsense on stage. The sound startled him. It wasn't the polite chuckle he offered in boardrooms, nor the restrained amusement he saved for colleagues. It was rawer, unguarded, a reminder of a version of himself he thought he'd left behind years ago. When Lily scampered to the counter to examine the pastry case, Ethan leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "You didn't have to come," he said. His words held more weight than he intended. Sophie met his gaze, hazel eyes steady. "I know," she admitted softly. "And yet you did." He pressed, watching the faint hesitation cross her face. Her eyes flickered, as though weighing how much truth to give. "Lily's special. She reminds me of what matters." She paused, then caught herself. "And you?" Her voice trailed off before she shook her head, a small smile curving at her lips. "Well, you're not what I expected." Ethan tilted his head. "What did you expect? A stiff, arrogant executive," Sophie confessed with a wry smile. "The kind of man who hires a date for a party just to keep up appearances." He almost smiled. "That's exactly what I did." "Yes," she said softly, not looking away. "But you're also a father who clearly loves his daughter more than anything." That wasn't part of the act. For a long moment, they sat in silence, though silence felt like the wrong word. The space between them was full, charged with something unspoken. Ethan studied her expression, the careful mix of restraint and sincerity, and felt that dangerous shift again, the one that made him think of words like forever. Lily returned with a chocolate croissant clutched proudly in both hands, crumbs already dusting her dress. "Look, Daddy." Sophie said I could choose. Ethan reached for a napkin, his smile faint but real. As he wiped her hands clean, his eyes lifted briefly to Sophie's. She was smiling too, not just at Lily but at him, and in that glance something undeniable passed between them. Ethan didn't name it, not yet. But as Lily broke the pastry in half and pressed a piece into Sophie's hand like an offering, Ethan knew this was no longer a performance. This was something far harder to contain. Days slipped into weeks with a rhythm Ethan hadn't anticipated. At first, he told himself each new meeting with Sophie was incidental, a small favor, a harmless convenience, an excuse carefully justified. But excuses blurred quickly into invitations, and invitations into patterns. It began with Lily's school project. "She listens better when someone else explains," Ethan said lightly over the phone, as if that excused the call. Sophie came, sat cross-legged on the floor beside Lily, helping her glue bright scraps of paper into place. Ethan lingered in the doorway, arms folded, pretending to check emails, but watching the scene more than the screen. Sophie was patient, encouraging Lily through each step, her laughter easy and warm whenever glue smeared across tiny fingers. Lily's grin stretched wider than Ethan had seen in months. Then there was the company picnic. Ethan tried to decline at first, citing work, but Lily protested. "Not unless Sophie comes," she insisted. He gave in. Sophie arrived in a simple sundress, her hair tied back, no effort to impress beyond being present. Lily clung to her side while colleagues and their families mingled on the lawn. Ethan noticed the glances from his staff, The curiosity in their eyes when they saw the way Lily leaned against Sophie, as though she had always belonged there. For once, Ethan didn't mind being the subject of speculation. Coffee became a habit too. Not formal meetings, not orchestrated performances, just quiet interludes in cafes or the penthouse kitchen. Sometimes Sophie shared small pieces of her past, stories about audition nerves, a childhood summer camp, or the book she read 3 times because the ending kept surprising her. Ethan found himself listening with a focus he rarely gave anyone, his guarded edges softening. Every time Sophie came over, Lily's face lit with unfiltered joy. And every time she left, the absence pressed into the apartment like a hollowness Ethan couldn't ignore. He told himself to be cautious, to protect Lily from disappointment, to protect himself from the dangers of wanting. But each time Sophie returned, those warnings felt weaker. One evening, dinner lingered into twilight. Sophie stayed, helping clear the plates, laughter weaving easily between her and Lily. When bedtime came, Lily refused to settle until Sophie agreed to read the story. Ethan didn't argue. He leaned against the doorframe, watching as Sophie curled up on the couch with Lily nestled against her side. Sophie's voice softened as she read, animated enough to make the pages breathe. Lily's eyelids drooped, her hand clutching a piece of Sophie's sleeve as though anchoring herself there. Ethan's chest tightened at the sight. He couldn't remember the last time his daughter had looked so safe, so content. When Lily's breathing deepened into sleep, Sophie brushed a gentle kiss across the crown of her head and tucked the blanket around her. Ethan felt something shift inside him, something too large to dismiss. Sophie looked up, catching his gaze. For several seconds, neither spoke. The quiet between them was thick, not empty but charged, as though words might break something fragile. Ethan's throat ached with the truth he had tried to bury. He didn't just admire Sophie's kindness, didn't just appreciate her presence. He wanted her here, permanently. He crossed his arms, steadying himself, but the thought refused to leave. This is everything I didn't dare hope for. A home that doesn't echo. A daughter who laughs freely. A woman who doesn't feel like an intrusion, but an answer. Sophie adjusted the blanket one last time, then slowly rose, her expression a mixture of tenderness and hesitation. Ethan didn't move, didn't break the connection of her eyes. There was more here than convenience, more than circumstance, and they both knew it. The apartment was cloaked in the kind of stillness that follows a child's surrender to sleep. The only sounds were the faint hum of the city beyond the glass and the soft tick of the clock on the far wall. Ethan lingered near the doorway, arms folded across his chest, but his posture betrayed a tension that had nothing to do with fatigue. He was watching the scene in front of him, a tableau that seemed almost too fragile to disturb. Lily curled against Sophie on the couch, small fingers still gripping the fabric of her sleeve even in sleep, her chest rising and falling in the slow rhythm of dreams. Sophie's voice had gone silent now, the storybook resting closed on her lap. She leaned her head slightly, studying Lily's face with an expression Ethan had not seen directed at his daughter before, an expression both protective and tender, as if the child in her arms mattered in a way that had nothing to do with obligation. It carved something open inside him. When Sophie finally looked up, her eyes found his immediately. They held for several seconds, neither moving, neither speaking. The quiet felt charged, heavy with truths too large for silence, yet too uncertain for words. Ethan's breath caught, the weight of everything he had been suppressing pressing against his ribs. "She loves you," he said at last, voice low, almost reverent. Sophie's lips parted, a faint tremor in her breath. "Ethan," she whispered, as if warning him not to say what was already there between them. But he didn't stop. For once, control had no place here. "And so do I." The words startled even him, raw and unpolished, slipping past years of discipline. He drew a breath, steadying his tone. "I tried not to. I told myself this was business, nothing more. But every day you walk out that door, I want to ask you to stay." Sophie's eyes shimmered, her expression torn between fear and longing. She looked down at Lily, still sleeping soundly, then back at him, her hesitation visible. This wasn't supposed to happen. "No," Ethan agreed softly, stepping closer. But it did. Silence stretched again, thicker now, filled with the pull of what neither could deny. Ethan wanted to close the distance, to anchor the words with touch, but before he could move, a small, drowsy voice broke the air. "Daddy," Lily mumbled, half dreaming, her cheek pressed against Sophie's arm. "Can Sophie stay forever?" The words floated in the room like a benediction, simple and unguarded, yet heavier than any contract Ethan had ever signed. Sophie blinked rapidly, tears threatening at the edges of her eyes. Ethan felt his throat tighten, the ache of hope and fear colliding. He crossed the room slowly, lowering himself onto the couch beside them. Lily shifted but didn't stir, her little hand still fisted in Sophie's sleeve. Ethan reached across and took Sophie's hand in his own. His grip was firm, certain, and when he spoke, his voice was steady. "I think," he whispered, his gaze moving between the woman and the child who had altered the shape of his world. "She already has." The room seemed to hold its breath after Ethan's words. Sophie's hand trembled faintly in his, her eyes locked on his with a mixture of vulnerability and wonder. She had walked into his life under the guise of performance, a role meant to be temporary. And yet here she was, woven into the most sacred part of his world. Lily murmured in her sleep again, shifting slightly, but refusing to release her hold on Sophie's sleeve. Ethan's gaze lingered on that small hand. Unconscious trust, unshaken devotion. For 7 years, he had shielded his daughter from disappointment, from instability, from the sharp edges of a world that took more than it gave. Now, for the first time, he saw the possibility of something different, not protection built from walls, but safety born from presence. Sophie swallowed, her lips parting as if to protest, then closing again. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, unsteady. "Ethan, I don't know if I'm what you need. What Lily needs." "You're exactly what we need," he said, no hesitation in his tone. The certainty surprised even him, but it felt truer than anything he had spoken in years. "I've built everything in my life on control, on not taking risks I can't measure. But you've already changed everything. You've given her laughter again. You've given me something I thought I couldn't want anymore." Her eyes glistened, hazel shimmering under the dim light. "This wasn't supposed to happen," she whispered again. But this time it carried less resistance and more awe, as though she couldn't quite believe the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Ethan reached up, gently brushing a strand of auburn hair from her face. "No," he agreed softly. "But maybe the best things never are." Sophie looked down at Lily, her expression breaking into a tender smile. She adjusted the blanket carefully, her fingers lingering a moment longer on the child's small hand. When she lifted her eyes back to Ethan, they carried a quiet surrender. "She's remarkable," Sophie murmured. "She is," Ethan said. His voice caught slightly, then steadied. "And so are you." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of promises unspoken, of fears acknowledged, of a future neither had dared to imagine but now found impossible to deny. Lily shifted once more, curling closer to Sophie, her breathing deep and even. Ethan tightened his hold on Sophie's hand, not as a question, not as a plea, but as an answer. Outside, the city lights glittered against the night sky, the hum of traffic muted by height and glass. Inside, the penthouse no longer felt like a fortress built by a man against loneliness. It felt like a home, unfinished, imperfect, but alive. Sophie leaned into him slightly, the weight of her presence grounding, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "If I stay, it's not because of a contract. It's not because of obligation." Ethan's lips curved into the faintest smile. "I wouldn't want it any other way." For a long while, they sat together. The CEO who had built walls, the woman who had unknowingly slipped past them, and the little girl who had already decided what mattered most. Forever, Ethan thought, glancing once more at his daughter's peaceful face. And for the first time in years, the word didn't frighten him. It felt like possibility. It felt like truth. It felt like home.